I'm pregnant with your husband's child," my daughter-in-law whispered in my ear at the family dinner, her voice soft enough that no one else at the table could hear it. And for a moment, I thought I had misunderstood the words because the dining room looked exactly the way a peaceful Sunday evening was supposed to look in a quiet American suburb, with the warm light above the table, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes drifting through the air, and my son Daniel pouring a second glass of red wine for everyone while the soft hum of the dishwasher came from the kitchen behind us. But Vanessa didn't move away after she said it. She simply straightened up beside my chair as if she had asked whether I wanted more salad, and when I slowly turned my head to look at her, she was smiling the same careful smile she used whenever neighbors visited or when someone complimented the house. Polite, controlled, almost friendly. The kind of smile that makes you question whether something cruel was ever said at all. And for a few seconds I just sat there holding my fork in midair while my heart pounded harder than it had since the day Harold's doctor called to tell me he wouldn't be coming home from the hospital. And that was when I realized something important, something that kept my hands steady even though my mind felt like it had slipped on ice. Because Vanessa had not whispered those words by accident. She had chosen that exact moment at the table, in a room full of family, with candles lit and glasses raised and the illusion of normal life wrapped around us like a stage set. And I understood that she was waiting for me to react, waiting for me to drop my fork or knock over my glass or shout something that would make every head turn toward me. But I didn't give her that. Instead, I placed the fork carefully on the edge of my plate and took a small sip of water while Daniel laughed about something his coworker had said earlier that week, completely unaware that the woman sitting beside him had just placed a quiet little grenade into the middle of my life. And when I looked down the length of the table, I noticed how ordinary everything appeared: the folded linen, napkins, the polished wood Harold had refinished himself 15 years ago, the bowl of green beans I had brought because Daniel used to love them when he was a boy. And it struck me how strange it was that the most destructive moments in a family never look dramatic from the outside. They arrive quietly, dressed as ordinary evenings, hidden behind polite smiles and the clink of silverware. And as Vanessa returned to her seat, she brushed a hand over Daniel's shoulder like a devoted wife while he continued talking about work deadlines and weekend plans. But before she picked up her glass, she glanced across the table at me again, and this time the smile was smaller, sharper somehow, as if she were checking whether the message had landed where she intended it to. And that was when a second thought began forming in my mind, slower and colder than the first wave of shock, because Vanessa hadn't simply shared a secret with me. She had delivered a challenge, one that depended entirely on what I would do next, and I realized that if I exploded in that moment, she would win whatever game she believed she was playing. Yet if I remained quiet long enough to think, truly think, I might begin to understand why she had chosen those words, why she had chosen me, and most importantly, why she had chosen tonight. And so while the rest of the family continued eating under the warm glow of the dining room light, I forced myself to breathe slowly and watch her carefully, because something about the confidence in her voice told me that Vanessa believed she had already changed the balance of power in our family with a single whisper, but she didn't yet understand one very simple truth about women who have lived long enough to bury a husband and raise a son to adulthood, and that truth is this. When you have survived real grief, you learn not to react to the first shock you hear. You wait, you observe, and you let the silence reveal what the noise is trying to hide. I did not say another word for the rest of that dinner. And the strange thing about silence is that it makes you notice details you might normally ignore, like the way Vanessa kept her posture perfectly relaxed while Daniel talked about a new project at his office, or the way she occasionally rested her hand against the edge of the table as if nothing unusual had happened. And I watched her carefully while pretending to listen to my son describe a software client who had flown in from Denver earlier that week. Because when someone whispers something that explosive into your ear, you expect to see some kind of tension afterward, a flicker of nerves or guilt or excitement. But Vanessa did not look nervous at all. She looked prepared, and that realization settled into my mind slowly like cold rain soaking through a coat, because it meant she had planned the moment with care. And the more I thought about that whisper, the more I began to understand that she had not simply told me something shocking. She had handed me a puzzle piece and waited to see how long it would take me to notice the rest of the picture forming around it. And as Daniel reached across the table to refill my water glass, he gave me a quick smile. That reminded me so much of the boy he used to be that my chest tightened for a moment, because I could still see him at 10 years old sitting at our old kitchen table, finishing homework, while Harold grilled hamburgers outside on summer evenings. And it struck me how strange it was that the life we spend decades building can suddenly feel fragile, without any warning. Not because something loud or violent has happened, but because a single sentence quietly changes the way you look at the people sitting across from you. And while the rest of the meal continued with polite conversation about weekend errands and the upcoming church fundraiser, I found myself thinking back over the last year of Harold's life in a way I had not allowed myself to before, remembering small moments that had seemed harmless at the time, like the afternoons he said he was meeting an old friend for coffee, or the times he insisted on running errands alone, even though we had always done those things together. And at the time I had told myself that retirement changes people, that a man who has worked for 40 years deserves the freedom to wander through his own days without explanation. But sitting there in my son's dining room, with Vanessa calmly cutting her chicken into neat pieces, I began to realize how easily a person can overlook details when love encourages you not to question them. And that thought did not bring anger the way you might expect. It brought something quieter and heavier, a slow awareness that the past may not be as simple as the memories we keep polishing in our minds. And when the plates were finally cleared and Daniel stood up to carry them into the kitchen, he asked if anyone wanted coffee, the same way Harold used to ask, after every Sunday dinner at our house. And Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair and placed one hand against her stomach in a casual gesture that might have looked ordinary to anyone else, but felt deliberate to me now. And I realized then that she was not only waiting for my reaction tonight. She was watching me, measuring my silence, testing whether I would confront her immediately or retreat into confusion. And the truth is that a younger version of me might have demanded answers right there in that room. But life has a way of teaching patience to those who survive long enough to see how complicated people can become. And so while Daniel disappeared into the kitchen and the coffee machine began to hum softly on the counter, I sat there looking across the table at the woman who had just changed the meaning of my entire evening with one whisper. And instead of asking the question she expected, I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and met her eyes with the calmest expression I could manage. Because something in the confidence of her smile told me that whatever story she had just started was far from complete. And if I wanted to understand the truth behind it, I would need to listen very carefully to what the next few days decided to reveal. I drove home that night with the windows cracked open, even though the air outside was colder than it should have been for early October, because something about the quiet inside the car felt heavier than the cool wind moving through it. And the road that I had driven hundreds of times before suddenly seemed longer than usual, each streetlight passing over the windshield like a slow metronome, counting down the seconds of a thought I could no longer ignore, because Vanessa had not simply whispered a rumor or an insult. She had delivered a statement that she expected me to carry with me long after that dinner ended. And as the tires rolled over the familiar curve near the old maple trees outside our neighborhood, I found myself replaying the exact tone of her voice again and again. Not dramatic, not emotional, just calm and deliberate. The tone of someone placing a piece on a chessboard and waiting for the other player to realize the game has already begun. And the strange thing was that the more distance I put between myself and Daniel's house, the clearer my thoughts became. Because grief has a way of fogging the past when it first arrives, but time slowly sharpens it again. And for the first time since Harold passed away, I allowed myself to look honestly at the final months of our marriage without the soft filter of nostalgia that widows often wrap around their memories. And small details began rising to the surface like objects floating up from the bottom of a quiet lake. Things that once seemed harmless, but now carried a different weight when placed beside Vanessa's whisper. Like the way Harold had suddenly taken an interest in early morning walks, even though he had never been a morning person during the 42 years we were married. Or the afternoons when he would say he needed to stop by the hardware store, yet return home with nothing but a vague explanation about how the shelves had been out of stock. And at the time I had never questioned those things because marriage, especially a long marriage, teaches you not to interrogate every small change in the rhythm of someone's day. You assume that familiarity means safety, that shared history means loyalty. But sitting alone at the red light near the corner pharmacy that night, I felt something inside my understanding shift slightly. Not enough to break anything, but enough to reveal that the picture I had trusted for decades might have missing pieces. And yet, even with that realization settling into my thoughts, I still knew one thing with absolute certainty. Vanessa had chosen her words carefully. She had not said she was expecting a child in a vague way. She had tied that claim directly to Harold's name, and she had whispered it to me instead of announcing it to Daniel, which meant the message was meant for me alone, meant to disturb my sense of what had been true in my own home. And when I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light automatically flickered on the way it always did, casting the same warm glow across the front steps Harold had repaired 3 summers ago. And I sat in the parked car for a moment longer looking at that familiar light, thinking about the difference between secrets and accusations, because a secret is something a person protects, but an accusation is something a person releases into the air expecting it to travel somewhere dangerous. And Vanessa had not protected anything that night. She had released something she believed would grow heavier in my mind with every passing hour. But as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the quiet house that Harold and I had shared for most of our adult lives, I realized that the real question was not whether Vanessa's whisper had been true or false. The real question was why she wanted me to believe it so badly. And experience had taught me that when someone wants you to believe a story before you have asked for it, there is usually another story standing quietly behind it, waiting for the moment when patience finally brings it into the light. I did not turn on the television that night, and I did not make the cup of tea that had become my quiet routine since Harold passed away, because the house felt different the moment I stepped inside, not frightening and not unfamiliar, just heavier with the kind of stillness that invites old memories to speak a little louder than usual. And as I placed my purse on the small wooden table by the front door, I noticed the faint smell of lemon polish lingering in the air from the morning when I had wiped down the living room shelves, the same shelves where Harold kept his fishing trophies, and the framed photograph of Daniel graduating from college 15 years ago. And standing there in that soft yellow light, I realized how strange it was that one whisper from Vanessa had suddenly made me look at my own home with a different kind of attention. The kind of attention you use when you are trying to remember something you once overlooked. And so instead of going straight to bed, I walked slowly through the house the way Harold and I used to do when we first bought it nearly 3 decades ago, pausing near the kitchen doorway, running my hand across the smooth counter where we used to roll pie dough together on Sunday afternoons. And each room carried the quiet echoes of an ordinary life that had always felt stable and predictable. Yet my mind kept circling back to those last months before Harold died, not with anger, but with a careful curiosity that had been missing before, because grief has a habit of protecting memories by wrapping them in kindness, and only later does the mind begin to examine the details that kindness once ignored. And as I reached the hallway that led to our bedroom, I remembered one particular afternoon the previous winter when Harold had come home later than usual with a small paper bag from the grocery store, even though we had already done our weekly shopping together that morning. And when I had asked what he forgot, he laughed and said he had only gone out to buy fresh apples because the ones in our kitchen bowl had started to soften. But now that memory carried a slightly different weight, not because the story itself sounded suspicious, but because I suddenly realized that Harold had never once mentioned the apples again. They had never appeared in the kitchen, and at the time I had simply forgotten about it the way people forget small things every day. Yet now that quiet detail floated back into my thoughts like a piece of driftwood rising to the surface of water, and I sat down at the edge of the bed slowly, looking at the nightstand where Harold used to leave his reading glasses and the paperback novels he loved to fall asleep with. And what struck me most was not the possibility that something in the past had been hidden from me, but the calm certainty growing in my chest that Vanessa had expected her whisper to break. Something inside me, she had expected confusion, perhaps even panic, because people who deliver secrets in that careful tone often believe the shock itself will do most of the work for them. But what she did not understand was that time changes the way a person receives difficult information. And after spending 42 years married to the same man, and then learning how to continue living after losing him, the mind develops a strange kind of patience, a willingness to let questions sit quietly until the right moment reveals more than emotion ever could. And so as the old wall clock in the hallway ticked steadily past 10 o'clock that night, I leaned back against the headboard and allowed my thoughts to move slowly across the past year again. remembering how Vanessa had gradually become more present in family gatherings, how she had volunteered to help Harold carry boxes into the garage during one Thanksgiving visit, how she once insisted on staying late after dinner to help him organize tools in the basement while Daniel and I watched a football game upstairs, and none of those moments had seemed remarkable at the time. Yet now I could see them lined up in a new arrangement, not as proof of anything definite, but as a pattern that had never been examined before. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet reflection, another realization began to settle into place. One that felt almost as important as Vanessa's whisper itself. Because if she had truly believed her story would destroy my sense of the past, she would have revealed it loudly at the dinner table for everyone to hear. But she did not do that. She leaned close and spoke only to me, which meant the real target of that sentence had never been Daniel or the family sitting around the table. The real target had been my own memory of the life I shared with Harold. And as I finally turned off the bedside lamp and let the room fall into darkness, I understood something simple and steady that made sleep easier to find than I expected. Vanessa may have believed she had introduced doubt into my mind, but doubt does not weaken the truth when a person has the patience to wait for it. And patience was something I had learned long ago. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept poorly, but because my mind had already begun organizing the quiet questions that Vanessa had placed there the night before, and the sunlight coming through the kitchen window looked exactly the way it always did, pale and soft against the wooden floor Harold had insisted on installing himself years ago. Yet the ordinary rhythm of the morning felt slightly sharper, as if every small detail carried a purpose I had not noticed before. And while the coffee brewed, I stood at the counter remembering something Harold used to say whenever Daniel struggled with a difficult math problem as a boy, that the fastest way to understand confusion was not to argue with it, but to write down what you knew for certain and then examine everything else patiently. And that simple habit returned to me now as naturally as breathing. Because if Vanessa had expected her whisper to shatter my sense of the past, she had underestimated the power of calm observation. And I began with the few facts that could not be changed no matter what story she wanted me to believe. Harold had passed away 8 months earlier after a sudden heart condition. Vanessa had been part of our family for nearly 7 years through her marriage to Daniel, and the claim she made at dinner had been delivered quietly and deliberately without Daniel hearing it, which meant the message was meant to reach me first before anyone else. And as I carried my coffee to the dining table, I remembered another detail that had seemed unimportant until now. A brief conversation Harold and I had shared one evening not long before he died, when he mentioned that Daniel and Vanessa had been arguing about finances and that Vanessa seemed unusually concerned about long-term plans for the family property. And at the time I had brushed that comment aside, because married couples often disagree about money without it meaning anything serious. Yet now that memory drifted back with a slightly different color, not as proof of deception, but as a reminder that Vanessa had always been attentive to matters involving inheritance and long-term security. And sitting there with the morning light filling the room, I realized something that made the entire situation clearer than it had been the night before. If Vanessa truly believed what she whispered was a personal truth she wanted me to understand, she would have spoken with worry or hesitation. But her voice had carried none of those things. Instead, it had carried confidence, the kind of confidence people use when they believe they are controlling the direction of a story rather than revealing it. And that difference mattered more than the words themselves, because it meant her statement was not simply information. It was strategy, and strategies always have a purpose beyond the moment they are delivered. And as I finished the last sip of coffee, I stood up and walked toward the small cabinet near the hallway where Harold used to keep important documents. Not because I expected to find a dramatic answer hidden there, but because life has taught me that when someone introduces doubt into your mind, the most effective response is not panic, but careful review of the quiet truths already surrounding you. And inside that cabinet were years of ordinary records, bank statements, property paperwork, insurance forms, the small administrative pieces that make up the invisible structure of a household. And as I flipped slowly through the folders, I found myself thinking less about Harold and more about Vanessa's timing, because her whisper had arrived months after his passing, long after grief had settled into something manageable, which meant she had waited deliberately for the right moment. And people who wait that carefully are rarely acting on impulse. They are acting with a goal in mind. and by the time the clock above the kitchen doorway reached 9:30 that morning, I understood something important enough to bring a quiet sense of balance back into the room. Vanessa may have believed that a single sentence could force me into confusion about the past, but in reality she had done something far more useful for me. She had revealed that whatever story she wanted to tell had not yet been finished, and that meant I still had time to watch, to listen, and to learn exactly why she wanted that story to exist in the first place. By the middle of that afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the house had returned to something that looked almost normal, yet the difference between normal and peaceful is something a person learns to recognize after enough years. And while the clock above the kitchen doorway moved slowly toward 3 o'clock, I found myself thinking less about Harold and more about Vanessa's confidence. Because confidence without hesitation usually means preparation, and preparation usually means someone has already thought several steps ahead. And the more I considered that possibility, the more I realized that waiting for Vanessa to reveal her next move might take weeks or even months, which meant patience alone would not be enough if I truly wanted to understand what she believed she had set in motion. And that thought brought to mind someone I had not spoken with in nearly 2 months, a woman named Marlene Carter, who had been my closest friend since our sons played Little League together nearly 30 years ago. And although we had drifted into the quiet rhythm that long friendships sometimes develop, seeing each other mostly during church events or neighborhood gatherings, Marlene still possessed the one quality that had made her invaluable during every complicated moment in my life. She had spent more than 25 years working as a nurse at the regional medical clinic downtown, which meant she understood people in ways most of us never learn to see. And after a brief moment of hesitation, I picked up the phone and called her. Not because I expected her to provide answers, but because sometimes the most useful thing another person can offer is perspective, and when she answered, her voice carried the same warm steadiness it always had, asking how I was managing these days, and whether the house still felt too quiet without Harold walking through the rooms each morning, and I told her the truth about that part, that the quiet had grown easier to live with over time. But then I mentioned the dinner at Daniel's house and the strange conversation that followed, choosing my words carefully because I did not want to spread accusations or invite unnecessary judgment. Yet even with that restraint, I could hear the thoughtful pause on the other end of the line as Marlene listened. And when I finished explaining the situation, she did not react with shock the way many people might have. Instead, she asked a question so simple that it made me realize why I had called her in the first place. She asked whether Vanessa had spoken about this pregnancy to Daniel in my presence, or whether the statement had been directed only to me. And when I told her that the whisper had been delivered privately, she made a soft sound of understanding before responding in the calm voice that had comforted countless patients over the years, explaining that when people present sensitive information differently to different audiences, it often means they are shaping a narrative rather than revealing a fact. And that distinction matters because narratives depend on timing and reaction, while facts remain the same no matter who hears them first. And hearing that observation did not give me a solution to the mystery Vanessa had introduced, but it clarified something essential about the situation. Because if Vanessa had truly wanted the family to accept her claim immediately, she would have said those words across the table where Daniel could hear them clearly. Yet she had not done that. She had chosen a whisper meant to grow slowly inside my mind instead. And Marlene ended the conversation by reminding me of something I had once told her many years ago when her own family faced a difficult misunderstanding. That truth has a habit of revealing itself most clearly when people stop chasing it and begin observing the paths others take around it. And after I thanked her and hung up the phone, I stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, realizing that the story Vanessa had started was still unfolding somewhere beyond my view. But one thing had become certain during that short conversation. If Vanessa believed she was guiding this situation toward a specific outcome, she would eventually need to move the story forward herself. And when she did, I intended to be ready to notice every detail that followed. The next few days passed with a quiet rhythm that might have looked ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. But for me, every conversation and every small interaction began to feel like part of a larger pattern that had not yet fully revealed itself. And on Wednesday evening, Daniel called to ask whether I would like to come over for dinner again the following Sunday. His voice cheerful in the relaxed way it often sounded after a long day at work. And as he spoke, I could hear Vanessa in the background laughing softly at something on television. the sound floating faintly through the phone like a detail placed carefully into a scene, and I told him that I would be happy to come because I genuinely meant it, not because I wished to confront anyone, but because patience only works when you allow events to unfold naturally. And when Sunday finally arrived, the sky carried the pale gray color that often settles over our town. In late autumn, the kind of afternoon where the air feels cool enough to remind you that winter will not be far behind. And when I arrived at Daniel's house, Vanessa greeted me at the door with the same bright politeness she had always shown guests, asking how I had been feeling and whether the drive across town had been easy. Her tone so perfectly composed that anyone standing nearby would have believed nothing unusual had ever passed between us, and I realized in that moment that Vanessa possessed a particular talent for maintaining appearances, the kind of calm surface that allows a person to move through social situations without leaving any visible trace of tension behind. Yet beneath that surface I could sense the quiet alertness in her eyes, the subtle way she watched my reactions, as if measuring how much of her earlier whisper had settled into my thoughts. And throughout dinner, Daniel spoke enthusiastically about a potential promotion his company was considering, explaining how the new position might involve occasional travel to other cities like Chicago or Dallas. And while he talked, Vanessa listened attentively with one hand resting lightly against the table beside her glass of water, nodding at the appropriate moments, offering supportive comments in the careful tone of a partner who understands how important encouragement can be during uncertain career changes. And if someone had entered the room at that moment, they would have seen nothing more than a successful young couple sharing an ordinary evening with family. Yet every now and then Vanessa's gaze drifted briefly toward me before returning to Daniel, and each time our eyes met she offered the same small knowing smile that had followed her whisper days earlier, a smile that suggested she believed something unspoken still existed between us, something waiting patiently beneath the polite conversation unfolding at the table. And it occurred to me then that Vanessa was not simply waiting for my reaction. She was waiting for the right moment to guide the conversation in a direction she had already imagined. And as the meal continued, she eventually asked Daniel whether he had thought any further about the discussion they had been having regarding long-term plans for the house and the surrounding property, her voice light and casual, as if she were introducing a harmless topic about weekend errands. Yet the moment those words left her mouth, I noticed the way Daniel paused slightly before answering, explaining that he had not made any decisions yet because he wanted to consider every option carefully. And that small pause revealed something important to me, because it suggested that Vanessa had already been speaking with him privately about matters connected to the future of the family property. And suddenly her whisper from the previous Sunday began to appear in a different light, not as a random revelation, but as a carefully placed seed meant to grow into influence over decisions that had not yet been made. And when I glanced across the table, Vanessa was watching me again with that same composed expression, clearly expecting some reaction to the direction of the conversation. Yet instead of interrupting, I simply nodded thoughtfully and asked Daniel a practical question about his new position at work, allowing the subject to shift naturally away from property and plans. And although Vanessa continued smiling politely, I could see the faint flicker of surprise in her eyes, because sometimes the most powerful response to a strategy is not confrontation but patience, and patience has a way of revealing intentions far more clearly than any argument ever could. The conversation at the table drifted easily after that moment, yet the quiet shift in Vanessa's expression stayed with me long after the dishes had been cleared and Daniel had stepped into the kitchen to rinse the plates under the warm stream of water. And I could feel the subtle tension that sometimes appears when two people are waiting for a conversation to turn in a specific direction. Yet only one of them understands where that direction leads. And Vanessa eventually stood and carried the empty glasses toward the counter with a calm efficiency that would have impressed any guest who did not know the quiet currents moving beneath the surface of that room. And when she returned to the table, she paused beside my chair with the same polite smile she had worn since the evening began. But this time her voice lowered slightly as she spoke, not enough to sound secretive yet quiet enough that Daniel could not easily hear from the kitchen. And she asked whether I might have a moment to talk privately in the living room, explaining that she wished to discuss something important about the future of the family. And although the request was framed with gentle respect, the intention behind it felt unmistakably deliberate. and I nodded in agreement before standing slowly and following her across the soft rug toward the far side of the room, where the lamplight created a small island of quiet away from the kitchen doorway. And for a moment neither of us spoke, while Vanessa folded her hands together as if arranging her thoughts carefully. And then she began explaining in the same composed tone that she believed it was time for the family to think more seriously about long-term stability, about making decisions that would secure the property and ensure that the next generation would benefit from the work Harold had spent his life building. And the way she said those words carried the careful balance of someone presenting an idea rather than an argument. Yet behind the politeness, I could hear the quiet structure of a plan already forming. And she mentioned how important it was for Daniel to feel supported as he considered the possibility of expanding the house or adjusting certain financial arrangements. And as she spoke, she briefly rested her hand against her abdomen again in that casual gesture I had noticed earlier, a gesture that seemed designed to remind me of the whisper she had delivered days before. And I realized then that Vanessa was not simply discussing property or planning for the future. She was slowly weaving her earlier statement into the larger narrative she hoped would guide the family's decisions. And what interested me most in that moment was not the content of her words, but the confidence with which she believed the story would eventually persuade everyone involved. And when she finished explaining her thoughts, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for the confirmation she assumed would follow. Yet instead of reacting with surprise or accusation, I asked a simple question about the timing of the plan she described, asking whether Daniel had already spoken with a lawyer or financial advisor about these possibilities, and the brief pause that followed told me more than any long explanation could have revealed, because Vanessa had expected concern or emotional resistance, not quiet practical questions that shifted the discussion toward facts and details. And for a fraction of a second her smile faltered before returning to its carefully practiced form, and she answered that the conversation with Daniel had only just begun and that nothing had been finalized yet, which meant the strategy she had started with that whisper was still unfolding step by step. And as we stood there in the lamplight with the soft clatter of dishes continuing in the kitchen, I understood that the real story Vanessa wanted to tell was not about the past at all. It was about shaping the future of this family in a way that placed her at the center of every decision that mattered. And the more clearly that realization formed in my mind, the calmer I felt. Because when a person finally understands the direction of someone else's plan, it becomes much easier to recognize exactly when and how that plan will reveal its next move. I let Vanessa finish speaking without interrupting her, and when she finally paused, I noticed how carefully she watched my face, as if searching for a crack in my composure that might confirm the story she had been trying to build since that whisper at the dinner table the week before. But the truth was that the more clearly I saw the structure of her plan, the calmer I became. Because once you recognize the shape of someone's intentions, the confusion disappears, and all that remains is patience. And I simply nodded thoughtfully before thanking her for sharing her concerns about the future of the family property, explaining that long-term planning is always wise when a family has built something meaningful over many decades. And Vanessa's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she believed her words had finally reached the destination she intended. Yet what she did not realize was that the calm tone in my voice was not agreement but clarity. And when Daniel returned from the kitchen carrying 3 cups of coffee, the conversation drifted naturally back toward everyday subjects. Yet the quiet understanding that had settled inside me remained steady. And over the next several days I reflected carefully on everything that had happened since that first whisper, not with anger or suspicion, but with the same method Harold once taught Daniel, while helping him solve difficult problems at the dining table. Begin with the facts that cannot change, and let every other detail arrange itself around them. And the most important fact was something Vanessa seemed to overlook completely. Harold had been a meticulous man who believed strongly in protecting his family through careful planning. And several months before he passed away, he had worked closely with our attorney to organize every legal detail connected to our property and financial records. And those arrangements were documented clearly in files that had never left the small cabinet in my hallway, which meant the future of our home was not something that could be quietly reshaped by suggestion or implication. And when the following Sunday arrived, Daniel called again to invite me for dinner. His voice cheerful in the easy way it always sounded when he believed the family was moving forward normally. And as I drove across town, I felt none of the uncertainty that might have troubled me a week earlier, because clarity has a way of restoring balance once you allow it enough time to form. And during that dinner, Vanessa once again guided the conversation gently toward plans for the property, speaking about stability and responsibility and the importance of preparing for the next generation. And when she finally paused, Daniel glanced toward me with a curious expression, as if wondering what I might think about these ideas. And I smiled before setting my coffee cup quietly onto the table and explaining in the same calm tone I had used all evening that Harold had already addressed those concerns long ago, because his will and the legal trust he established months before his passing had placed the property under clear protections that ensured no sudden changes could ever be made without careful review and shared agreement. And the moment those words settled into the room, I noticed Vanessa's expression change ever so slightly, not dramatically enough for Daniel to question, but enough for me to understand that the story she had been quietly building had just encountered a detail she had not expected. And I added gently that Harold had always believed family decisions should grow from honesty rather than pressure, which is why he had left such thorough instructions for the future. And Daniel nodded thoughtfully, as if hearing something new about his father's planning that he had never fully understood before. And Vanessa remained silent for a moment longer than usual before offering a polite smile and changing the subject to a television show she had been watching recently. Yet beneath that calm surface I could sense the shift that had taken place, because strategies often depend on assumptions. And once those assumptions are removed, the strategy loses its direction. And as I drove home later that evening with the quiet streets glowing under the soft yellow streetlights, I realized that the whisper Vanessa had delivered days earlier had not changed the truth about my life with Harold or the foundation of the family we had built together. Instead, it had revealed something far more useful. It had shown me exactly how patient a person must be when someone else believes they are quietly rewriting the future, because the future does not belong to whoever speaks first. It belongs to whoever understands the truth well enough to wait.